Hello, today we're going to look at section D. I know this is a section most students struggle with, and honestly, I hated it so much as well when I was doing my A-level, so it's quite understandable. But today we're going to look at how to approach questions on section D, and hopefully I can help you out. So before we try an exam question together, let's look at some useful tips. It's really important to fully understand the skeleton code. Now, when I say fully, I mean each and every line of code, each and every subroutine. You should know how different things are interacting with each other, what is the purpose of these different attributes that are introduced, how they are introduced, and how they're working. Now, once you know how different things are working, it's a lot easier for you to try out those questions. So sometimes even if you don't get a chance to fully solve the question or fully reach the solution, you would still have some idea of what to do, and which will help you score at least a few marks on that question. Second thing, review the pre-read material. So you've got the document, make sure you fully understand what the program is doing, make sure you have tried it out. You should know how it works, what happens when you enter certain inputs, what happens when you try out something else. So yeah, pretty much just play around with the puzzle and make sure you understand each and everything. Thirdly, practice, practice, practice. Like, I can't stress this enough. Even if while you're practicing you feel like the questions aren't making sense, they're too hard, they're not helping you, still try those out. So you've got your wikibook questions, you've got your zigzag questions, you might have extra questions given to you by your teachers. It's really important to practice those. Even if you feel like they're very hard, they're not making sense to you, try them 2 times, 3 times, 5 times, as many times as it requires you to make sense of it. Try them. I know it's easier to say and harder to implement, but honestly, it's going to help you so much, because in your exam, there isn't anything harder than the questions which you might find on the zigzag or on the wikibook. So very beneficial to try those out. And make sure to break down the problem. Now, what I mean by that is, if you've got a question, try and look at it and think about, okay, what parts can I do? So it might be that it asks you to create a new class. Okay, that's something you can do. So you'd start off by doing that. Even if you can't fully write the code for what goes inside the class, at least start by doing what you can, so that you get some of the marks on that question. Then test your code, which is quite obvious. Obviously, you're going to test your code, but don't just test it and think, oh, it did not work, so let's move on to the next question. Actually try and see if you can do trial and error, if you can change something based on what output you've received. And again, that is something which can help you score those extra marks even if you don't reach a solution fully. Really important to manage your time well. Make sure you're leaving enough time for the last section, because you don't want to stress up. It might be that if you get the same question given to you in your class, you will be able to do it fully, but in exam, obviously there's time pressure. So we're going to start off with an easy question, just to give you a clear idea of how to approach these questions, and then we'll try one more question after this. Now, the question says, this question refers to the puzzle class. Introduce a new pattern option in the constructor of the puzzle class for the standard puzzle. Task 1 is to add a new pattern option into the puzzle to allow the pattern shown in figure 1 to be used in the standard puzzle. Task 2 says to test that the changes you have made work. So run the skeleton program, press enter to start a standard puzzle, input the new pattern into an available space on the grid, show that the program displaying the new pattern in the standard puzzle increases the score by 10. So first things first, you need to think about where exactly would you need to make those changes. So where in the code do we need to add the pattern? So thinking about where Q, T, and X were created in the code is helpful, because that just saves time. Let's look at the code and see how we can do that. So if we look at our puzzle method, we can see the pattern Q, X, and T are hard-coded in the constructor method. What we're going to do is pretty much just copy the code and then change it for our new pattern C. So first things first, let's just update the attribute name to C pattern. And now once we have changed that, let's just update the T to C as well, because that the first part of the parameter tells us what we want to see on the screen. Now, when it comes to the pattern itself, we need to think about the helix structure we looked at in the last video. So think about how would C be outputted in that 3x3 grid. And once you have figured out which boxes, which cells should have your C, it's pretty straightforward to work out the string for our pattern. So when we think about the letter C being laid out, it will only have the 4th cell and then the last cell, which is our cell 9th, empty. Then we are just going to append our allowed symbols and allowed pattern with C. Now when you run this code, you'll be able to see that this works perfectly. It allows you to enter this new symbol C. Now, if this question was to actually come up, here are some possible symbols they can give you. So C, H, I, J, K, L, O, U, Y. They can all be placed inside our 3x3 grid. So it's worth practicing those. But again, if you've understood this question, all of these implementations are quite straightforward. Okay, so this question asks us to introduce a wildcard. Now, at the moment when we have filled in the grid and we decide to put a new symbol, we are allowed to put a symbol in a cell which already contains one of the other symbols. So, for example, there's a Q in one of the cells. If I want to place a T in that cell, that's allowed. It would replace the Q with a T. However, they've asked us to introduce a wildcard which would be represented by W if such a situation occurs. So, let's see how we can approach this question. So let's start by doing what task 1 tells us to do. So it asks us to create a wildcard cell class, and then this class should inherit from our cells class. So what I'm going to do is underneath my cell class, I'm going to make this new class, and this should inherit the cells class. So I'll say class wildcard cell, and then inside the parameter I need to have cell because it would be inheriting from our cells class. Now inside the constructor method of our wild cell class, we want to have our super function used, which basically allows you to call methods of the superclass from within the subclass. So essentially what we are saying is execute the method of the cell class within the wildcard class. Then we're going to say self dot underscore symbol equals W. So this is basically us giving the symbol property of W to this class. Now we're going to create a new method is wild, and the reason why we're creating this new method is because the question says the class should have an appropriate assessor method to identify a wild card. So what this new method is going to do is it will determine if a cell is wild or not. So what I'm going to say is def is wild, and then it returns true if our card is wild. So before we move to the next part of the question, we need to make sure that this assessor method is also defined in our cell class. So I'm just going to define is wild into our cell class and then return it to false, just to make sure that we don't have any unexpected errors. Because essentially what we're doing is we were overriding this method in our wild class. So it should be declared in our parent class before it can be overridden. Now we need to make some changes to our attempt puzzle method in the puzzle class. But before we can do that, we'll need to create a new method which can get the patron symbol in a particular cell. So in our patron class, we're going to create a new method and we're going to call it get patron symbol. So this is essentially going to retrieve a symbol in a particular cell. Now we're going to head to our check for match with patron method, and inside that we're going to make some changes. So inside our method, instead of immediately constructing our patron string by concatenating the symbols, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a list called patron cell, and we're going to append this list for our patron. So the code is going to iterate through each cell in our patron to check if it's a wildcard. If it is a wildcard, as in if the wildcard is found, then we're going to set our wildcard in patron to true, indicating that we have found a patron that contains a wildcard. Then we're going to add an if statement to check if the wildcard is detected, and if we detect a wildcard, then we want to make sure that the patron string is updated accordingly. After matching the patron, the code checks if wildcard is present in the patron, and if wildcard is present in our patron, then the score would be returned as 15. If it's not present, then the score would stay as 10. We now need to head to our puzzle class, and inside the constructor method, we need to set the attribute for wildcards left to 2, because at the beginning of the game, we want to make sure that the user has got 2 wildcards. Now we're going to add a couple print statements inside our attempt puzzle method, because we want to make sure that the user knows how many wildcards they've got left and how many they have at the beginning. Now we need to make one more modification in this method. So we're going to add an if statement to check if the current cell isn't empty and that it hasn't got an @ symbol, so it's not blocked either. And if that is the case, then we're going to check if we've got any wildcards left. If we do have a wildcard left, then we are going to place a wildcard at the specified index, and now the index position can be copied straight away from the first line in our get cell method. So whatever the index says, that is going to be the position where we want to place our wildcard. Then we are going to decrease the wildcard number by 1 so that once it's used, it's updated as well. And if we haven't got any wildcard left, then we want to print a statement to let the user know that there are no more wildcards left. And then if the cell is either empty or it has got a blocked symbol, then we want to change the symbols in the current cell to the specified symbol. So the else statement would be executed if the cell is either empty or it has been blocked. Now when you run this code, you'll be able to see that this works perfectly.